So this is our final installment for the Tufshin Pay base. And it's good to see you all. I was on the road. We had the last two shiurim, but it wasn't very easy to see for the last 2 weeks. So I'm glad that we can go off out on a visual high, at least. So last week we began discussing a very interesting topic, which actually has a little bit of a spillover into next year. Not the first topic of next year, but we'll discuss and see what it is. So we're discussing the topic of pressurized or coercive sale, the principle of taluya v'zavin zvini, which means if a person is either pressured or coerced into selling his object or his property, what are the parameters in which that is going to be a valid sale or not? So the Gemara here, we started this last week. We made some progress, but it's a very big topic. We're not going to finish it this week either, but at least we're going to make more progress and discuss some aspects of it. So the Gemara here on Mem Zayin Omid Beis, and it's in the Mar Makomos as well on page number 1. So just 1 second. So the Gemara, towards the bottom of the page, tells us on Mem Zayin Omid Beis, the Gemara says, Omer Avhuna Taluya v'zavin zvini, that if a person is subject to a lot of pressure, and he is basically, faced with a very, practically no decision, but the decision either, to suffer either financial consequences or physical suffering or worse, or, he can neutralize all of that by acquiescing to the sale of his property. So the halach is taluya v'zavin zvini. The sale is a good sale. So the Gemara immediately jumps in, and the Gemara says, "My time. Why? What's the reason for that?" And of course, in those two teeny little, seemingly innocuous words, "My time" is a world, right? Meaning, the Gemara is initially troubled and skeptical. Why would it be that if you pressure somebody to selling his property, that would be effective?
Is this different than what the Gemara brings down many times, the Talmud, about the gangsters that used to pressure people to make sales? I mean, the Gemara mentions, it seems that gangsters existed even then. There were many circumstances where they were known to be the kind of people that would pressure it. The Gemara mentions that. Right.
The Gemara has earlier, the context of this Gemara is what we call lokach mi sirkrikun.
Yeah,
sirkrikun is like a Saracen, like a pirate or a bandit. So if that's what you mean, that's what you're referring to. What? The mob. Yeah, exactly. So it's like but these feelings like pirates, that this is what they did. I wouldn't say it was an honest living; it was a dishonest living, but it was a living. So that's actually the context, whether or not a sarkikun can ever have a chazaka, or a person who acquires from a sarkikun, can he establish what's known as a cheskas gimel shanim or not?
Why wouldn't he have the same chazaka rights as a ganaf, which we learned?
Well, a gazlan also, that's the Hanami, a ganaf and a gazlan, also the question whether they have a chazaka. Same basic idea. So in that context, the Gemara quotes Rav Huna as saying that taluya v'zavin zvini zini, that if somebody does pressure in that way, the sale is still effective. As we pointed out last week, when the Gemara says my taima, as I say, there's a lot packed in that my taima, because both legally and ideologically and instinctively, if you'd asked most people, if you'd asked me before I knew this Gemara, is that going to be an effective sale or not? I would have, predicted that the halacha would have invalidated it. Because as we know, you need das and a kinyan. That's why a katan, has very limited ability to be konen, to be makne, and a shota, somebody who's incompetent. And if somebody blunders into a kinyan by accident, not knowing that he's going through emotions, that's called nesasek. that doesn't work. And not only that, we have all sorts of rules that we've explored in different contexts. Onas rachmana patre, meaning there's no onshim for an act that is done coercively, but, l'nara l'sasa davar. But the Yerushalmi goes even further. The Yerushalmi says, onas keman delo ovid. Not only do you not get punishment for an act that is done under duress, but in many circumstances, it's not legally attributable to you. That's like, Rabbi Kiveger has a discussion in a famous tshuva, we've discussed it also many times, about misasek, that if a person does something, inadvertently, or, agav doing something else, he's trying to do A and he ends up, blundering into doing, B also, or instead. So, all the halacha has, like, very broadly speaking, really has standards for for things that you're accountable for, and for things that you are that are attributed or assigned to you, even formal actions. And if a person agrees to a sale because he seemingly has no choice, it's surprising initially that we have to get over our surprise and understand this.
There is a narrow difference in the
Yeah.
fact that in all the cases you mentioned, the person is not cognizant of what he's doing, so he doesn't have the real das. Here he has the das, he takes the money also, he accepts it and everything.
So it's taking the money.
He has a gun to his head, which is another story altogether, but it's different than all the other cases you brought up.
Right. I'm just saying that based on...
There is here a danger with regards to the Nazis having stolen arts or bought arts from Jewish people who were under duress.
Right. That's a great example.
Yeah, that frightens me, because I'm not in that business, of course, but it frightens me. In other words, it sounds as if it's a legitimate thing according to the Jewish law.
Right. So let me answer both points.
Does it make a difference if the sale, although under duress, was at a fair market price?
Excellent. So let me address all 3 points very quickly. The first point which you made, Andy, which was, there's a difference between people who are incompetent or unaware, and people who are pressured and under duress. That is certainly a distinction, and we're going to get to that, back to that in a moment. The only thing I would say is that the reason that I am bringing as background one is not because there's no distinction, but because the orientation, the perspective that demands a high level of awareness and cognizance is consistent with requiring a high level of ratzon and haskama. So even though it's an important distinction, and we'll see whether that isn't the point here, in terms of initial background or predictability, it's still a very relevant aspect. The second point, which the Chazan brings up, which is the case of example of looted art, during the war, is a great example of exactly what we're talking about. And then your ha'ara, which is, well, is the price commensurate to the value, is equally important. So we're going to see a little later on. I'm just going to jump ahead for a second since you both raised the question. But there's an interesting exchange between Rabbeinu Yonah and the Rajba. The Rabbeinu Yonah said that when the Rabbeinu Yonah made a distinction, let me say it this way, as background. The Gemara in the end of the Sugya makes a distinction between what's called Taluya v'Zavin and Taluya v'Yayiv. Taluya v'Zavin is a sale. And the point that you made, again, your first point, which was, he's getting money for this, right? And then the Chazan's point, which is how much money is he getting, right? Is he getting the right amount of money? So you should just be aware that the Gemara in the end of the Sugya says, Talui v'Zavin zvini, but Talui v'Yayiv ein matanaso matana, because there's no money. So this idea that, agreement per se, so then there's an interesting in between, and that's the question that you're both asking. Let's say there is money, right? But there's not a commensurate value. It's not a gift. You're not forcing him to give it away for nothing, gratis, but he's not getting top dollar or even equal value either. So if you want to see just for a second, just look in the Mar Makomos. We got it through the Rajba. Look at the Rajba on page. Look at the Rajba on page. I have it on page 5, I think. It's called Chidusha Rajba Second Bavasra Mem Ches on the base. Daha Isha Kesada Zu Damya. I don't know if everybody has that. It should be on page 5. So I'll just tell you what they say first. Rabbi Yonah came up with a chiddush. It's also quoted then in the Poskim and Shulchan Aruch, and the Tur and Shulchan Aruch, they date it. So Rabbi Yonah said the following fascinating distinction. He said, there's a difference between karka and metaltalin, real estate and mobilia. He said, after all, there's a halacha that karka ein lo ona. The idea of cheating in pricing, all things doesn't apply to karka. It only applies to metaltalin. That's a topic in its own right. Partially because it's hard to price real estate because, real estate is a long-term investment. It's more than its actual value. Again, a watch or a car, something that's mobile and that has limited shelf life. It has there's an
greater subjectivity to real estate value.
There's greater subjectivity. Right. And it's not always lefi shaito, either, because what will it be worth in the future, right? And that's whereas mobilia has a limited shelf life, and therefore its market value at the moment is far more crucial. Anyway, the din is that eino nob lekarkos v'yesho nob b'metaltalin. So Rabbi Yonah says a remarkable thing. He says, if you have taluya v'zavin, not a gift, a sale. He says, but you undercut the guy, the mobster, right? The Saracen, the pirate, the bandit, whatever you want to call him, who puts the gun to your head. He's not offering you equal value. He's offering you significantly less. Says the Rabbeinu Yonah, if it's karka, then we still think that zvini is vini, because eino nola karkos. If it's metaltalin and it's less than the value, let's say a sixth beyond the discrepancy. That's shtus b'mekach. That's usually the amount of pricing that's acceptable. The idea is that within a sixth, that's just the range of the price. And then beyond that, it's just, objectively in this market, you're being cheated. So those are very interesting halachos. The 5th parak of Bab Metzia, not for now, but they're very interesting, from a capitalistic point of view, what is how do you define price, right? Rabbeinu Yonah basically says that because eino nola karkos, then, in this case, he could lower the price significantly. It's still not considered a gift. And I'll show you inside in a second. The Rajba says, who cares whether yesh or eino no? We're not talking about hilchos hanoi here. We're talking about whether or not there's really an agreement, despite the pressure, to go along with the sale or not. So does somebody want to lose 50% or 40% or even 10% or 20% of their value just because the halacha says that, that if you had agreed to it in a non-threatening, coercive environment, then that depends on yesh or eino no b'karkos, meaning is it objectively within a ballpark figure, or is it, is it a mekach tos? It's like misidentifying the object, and it's invalid.
Yeah, but I think
But we're not talking about that here. We're talking about whether or not. So what the Rajba says is, I don't see any difference between that and a matana. The yichus of the distinction between matana and mecher is the fact that you're not getting. There's not sufficient quid pro quo. So if you're getting a lower,
saying basically that, look, the issue is nothing to do with no, right? The first issue, which should be the thing that's most surprising to us, is whether the sale is a valid sale.
Right.
Now, in order to start to get into no, is sort of almost.
No, we're assuming it's we know
ridiculous.
the.
We're getting into pratim of dinim
No.
and we're missing the fundamentals. So Rabbeinu Yonah says, look, if you want to go by the din, theoretically, there's no by karka. Okay, but
sure,
let's
but
stick to the fundamentals.
Right, but you're getting right. But there's a fallacy in your logic in that I'm building this. I'm structuring it to try to explain that I'm putting the din of Rav Huna, which we paskin like, that talui v'zav zvini. I'm putting it on the defensive a little bit. When the Gemara says my taima, what I'm trying to say is, yeah, this is really a shocking halacha. But since you're asking me specific questions, so I'm already operating with the assumption that everybody knows that we pass.
In every kinyan, I think the halacha Gemara emphasizes this. You need das makne and das kone.
Correct.
So shouldn't that the question?
The question is, do you have it here?
In view of the fact that it may, when you are under coercion, that the amount that you receive may very well be considerably less than the actual value, and isn't that this a basis for the makned saying I don't accept it?
Right. So this is the question, because on the one hand,
the question is, what's the definition of das?
Right. So on the one hand, that's what the Rajba said. Let's look at the language of the Rajba for just a minute, and you'll see this. So Rabbi Roth, your argument is the argument of the Rajba. You're in very good company. He says, listen, I don't care whether there's Onah or not Onah right now. I care whether or not there's Das or there's not Das. And just like there's a distinction between Matan and Mecher, there should be a distinction between a low-balling Mecher and a full-cost Mecher. If it's not full cost, then he's not going to agree to it. The reasoning of Rabbeinu Yonah is a little bit different. Rabbeinu Yonah is saying, listen, this guy made an offer that he can't refuse, meaning let's not forget that the alternative is physical suffering or financial or worse financial ruin. So given that the choices in front of him are bad and worse, bad and worse is better to choose bad. Right? And that's a choice too. But once you say that's a choice, then maybe it's a choice, even if it's a low ball figure, at least you're getting something. So you can see both parts of the argument, but I'm going to try to explain going forward. I think it's a fundamental argument about how you understand really how this works. But look for the language of the Rajba for a minute. The Rajba, second line, Yesh Mefarshim, third line, Mikan diktiku de talui v'zavin afilu b'pachos that's exactly what you were asking me. That the rule of talui v'zavin zvini applies even if the return is less than the value. Ta'isha miskadeshes bepruta, right? The Gemara has a case of what we call a shotgun marriage. The father-in-law comes over to the would-be son-in-law and he says, marry my daughter or else, right? So that's a case in the continuation of the Gemara in Mem Ches Amud Beis. It's called Taluya v'Kodesh, right? So that so the Rajba says some people think that as long as there's money and value, even if it's not commensurate, to the price. Because it's not worse than Isha. Right. That's Rabbeinu Yonah. But okay, fine. But I wanted to now read his objection. He doesn't say it's Rabbeinu Yonah, but on the Marmakomos here, unfortunately, we're going to have time to read it inside, but you can read it at your leisure. Rabbeinu Yonah is the one who says this. So the Rajba says, I think it's wrong. Why? Rabbi Roth, this is exactly what you said. He said, we don't really care about Onah here. I mean, we do, but we don't. We don't care that there's no violation of Onah. What we really are trying to figure out is this fellow agreeing under pressure, or is he still holding out, just that he has no choice? That's a very fine, subtle line. The Agavon says,
your whole wording
Gomar, just one more. Let me just finish the
He
sentence.
agreed under pressure. So the word agreed, he still
sorry?
agreed. So that's
No.
the point
So
of defining das. He agreed. Okay,
No.
the guy who doesn't know where he's coming from,
The answer is that
or a shota, okay, he can't make a kinyan because he doesn't know what.
right. I understand, but basically, this is the question. The question is: there is every agreement, or if I mouth the words "I agree," or you'll see in the Gemara later on. This is a discussion. Do I have to say "rotzani" formally? Is every agreement the same?
So if he takes the money and says, "I have no choice," okay, I'll take it.
Yeah, because because they're looting his property. Either they'll give him something, or they'll give him nothing, or they'll damage him, physically or financially worse. So it's an assessment to at what point is that considered to be a threshold minimal agreement, as opposed to I don't agree, but I'm trying to salvage. Am I making a choice? Or am I choosing salvation? Do you understand what I'm saying? It's a very fine line. That's what I'm trying to show. This whole topic is about that subtle, fine line. When under pressure do you agree, but it's considered an agreement? And if so, is it considered a full agreement or a pressured agreement? Like, are there two levels in the halakha of agreement, pressured agreement and full agreement? And are there nafkamina? And when, at what point you don't have the ability to fight back, but you're not really agreeing, right? You're just making the best of a bad situation, but it's not like you've come to terms with it and you've agreed. These are very subtle things, subtle distinctions, and things like, do you have to say rotzani, yes or no? Does it matter whether this is subject to ona or not, and you're getting a lesser price or no? Could there have been such a concept in a matana? The Gemara concludes no, but could there have been, even in theory, at any point? Yes or no? Hard to know. The more you pressure, the more likely you're agreeing, or the more pressure there is, the more likely it is that even if you acquiesce, it's not really an agreement.
Now, this is by ignoring ono as an issue altogether, right?
Now, the Rajba is saying to ignore ono. Rabbi Yonah is saying, well, if it's Rabbi Yonah is saying a little bit like you. He's saying, well, listen, if he agrees, he agrees. And as long as once he agrees, you plug it into the regular halachic rules, and and that's what the story is.
Oh, no.
And the Rajba is saying you can't plug it into the regular rules because default, this whole transaction appears to be tainted, from the very beginning because he's under pressure. So there's really what I'm trying to point out is there's a massive argument among the Mefarshim here. Whether if you paskin like Rav Huna that Taluy v'Zavin Zvini, which you'll see in a moment, is based on the reasoning of Agav Onse Gamar Makne, that because given the reality of his limited choices and the pressure, he gives in, meaning he ends up. So the question really is that very mechudash and very limited? Because it's kind of a compromised das, and therefore it only works under certain conditions? Or are we really saying that, listen, in life, there are realities. We face those realities, and based on the choices that exist at the moment, we make decisions. So this is actually, if you take, if you don't look at the circumstances as part of the substance or content of the das, but as the background for the decision that he has to make. So he's making a full decision. He's deciding, I'd rather not get beaten to a pulp. I'd rather not lose everything. And therefore, I'm going to accept this.
Actually, as you look at it now, ono starts to take a critical role, because if you think about it, ono works two ways.
Yeah.
Underselling also is an ono.
Yeah, either direction. Because then it's ono for him.
Imagine I come to you, I know you're desperate. You have to pay somebody off tomorrow with money and you don't have it.
Right.
And I offer you a ridiculous price. Here's my cash right now. And you have the debt to pay, and I take it for half the price. Now that's ono in the other direction.
Correct.
And yet it's the same pressure. I don't have the mobster gun. But I took advantage.
You know what? So let's go back to I want to do, given that I'm trying to portray two perspectives on this issue, right? Again, we paskin like Rav Huna, Talui v'zaven zvini, zvini. That it works. We're trying to figure out, does it work begrudgingly and problematically and therefore in limited fashion? Because it's called ones or ratzon ba'ones, and that's works, but it's far from the conventional das makna and das kona. Or does it reach the threshold of regular das kona and das makna given the limited choices that you have? So now I want to go back and show you the 3 or 4 different stages in the Gemara. In light of especially of what you just asked, you're going to see that your comment just now is the first, but then immediately rejected suggestion of the Gemara. So let's go back for a minute, because we're talking about a lot of things, but I want to show you that these are real things. They're not just, meaning that's what the Chachamim were, the Amoraim, and then the Rishonim, and then they were also talking about exactly these things. This is exactly what they were thinking about. So let's go back for a minute. Amar Rav Huna, Talui v'zaven zvini zvini. Okay? A pressured sale is a sale. That's a chiddush, in my opinion. Because you're right, it's not a maisa ones, that you don't have a choice, but it is pressure. It's certainly less than optimal das makna and das kona, correct? So that's what the Gemara says my time is. So the first idea that the Gemara suggests is the last one that you just suggested, which is, says the Gemara, Kol de mazbin inish ilav de onis lo have a mazbin. V'afilu hachi zvine zvine. So this is very remarkable. The first thing that the Gemara suggested was, you know what? What's the big deal? The guy's putting a gun to your head and you're trying to figure out whether or not that's, considered ones. Of course it's ones, but maybe, given the reality, that's ratzon. Every time I have to make a tough financial decision, there's pressure. It's called internal pressure. Look at Rashbam for a minute, or in the Marmakomos on the page, it could be either way. He explains, what does this mean? He says, the kol demaz beninish rov chafatzim ukli beisav ataliso she'adam mocher. Let's say, you have a prized family, I'm exaggerating, but heirlooms, the candlesticks, an esrog box, that you got Yerusha. It's been in the family for 2,000 years. Okay, and all of a sudden you have to send your child to yeshiva or to college or to graduate school, or you have to, prepare for Shabbos or Yantif, right? Isn't that pressure? Isn't that an unhappy reality that you're content with, that you wish ideally that you didn't have to deal with? Ilav da'anis v'dachik b'mos lava mazbin, says the Rashbam, explaining that's what the words mean in the Gemara, right? Where the Gemara says, right? Kol demazbin inish ilav da'anis lo ava mazbin. So the first thought of the Gemara is, it's all baked in, meaning that's, of course that works. There's no difference between external pressure and internal pressure. Either way, you wish you didn't have to make the choice. And either way, realistically, in the real world, this is the choice that you face right now. In one case, it's, I need to put food on the table and therefore I have to sell my candlesticks. In the other case, it's I need to get his gun, away from me, and therefore I need to sell him the property. That's still the better choice that I have. Now, isn't that remarkable? That now immediately the Gemara jumps in and makes a distinction. The next line, the Gemara says, "V'dilma shiny onsa denafshe mi onsa dachrini." Right? Excuse me. There's a difference between internal pressure and external pressure. Right? By that, the Gemara means to say, internal pressure is like dreaming that you live in a different world. And, it doesn't count. Right now, you have to make a decision. You have priorities, So what might have been, what could have been if you were, in a situation where, you were not financially, pressed. That's all hypothetical, right? The gun, no one is really holding a gun to your head. And therefore, it's all about priorities. And that gets baked into or structured into decision-making. Decision-making, right, means there's a context, a framework. In this case, it's the candlesticks are precious to you, but your Shabbos meal, or your college tuition, or your yeshiva tuition, is even more precious. That's all the context. And now comes the decision. Are you going to sell this in order to accomplish that? That's a regular decision, right? But if somebody puts a gun to your head, that's not an internal hishuv, right? He's interfering. Originally, the Gemara thought that those are the same. Now, when the Gemara thought they were the same, there are still two schools of thought. What's interesting is that the Rashbam thought that when the Gemara thought it was the same, the Gemara was saying, you see from the gun to the head that even internal pressure is really a compromise in pure will or volition. Look at Rashbam. Let's continue with the Rashbam where we were. He says, "Afilo hachi havas vini bal korcho, afilo lo gamar makni." Even if he doesn't come to full peace with his decision, it's not like there's a difference in the halacha between a case where the guy has no financial pressure, but he makes priority decisions to buy and to sell for investment reasons or whims or whatever, and a case where he does have financial pressure and he has to choose priorities. We don't find that distinction. Ella kulu kona lokeach, v'hochanami, he's comparing that to a gun to the head. Literally, the guy's hanging him on, threatening to hang him. Afagav the anis mocher, even though the mocher is under pressure, kona lokeach. Hold the kibul damim. Afagav the lo gamar makni. But what's so fascinating is when the Gemara thought to equate them, the Rashbam thought that the equation is based on viewing both as compromised das. Then when the Gemara turns around and says, no, how can you compare those two things? One is external, the other is internal. One is just called decision making. The other is called pressure. Shiny onsed nafshem yonsed achrini. That's when the Rashbam says, when you're making a calculation and a decision, even if you wish you weren't in that circumstances, but it's all internal, that's called decision making. That's called gomer makni. That means whatever the background and whatever I might have wished was different, that's all just background noise. But you are making, that's called gomer, that's a full-fledged ratzon. But if somebody's pressuring you, and he's leaving you no choice, and it's because of his agenda, not because of your agenda, is that gomer makni? Right? Shemachrichin osalimkar hasam lo gomer makni, says the Rashbam. So how do we know that kind of pressure even works? Maybe it's considered onus and bal korcho, and it doesn't work at all. But what I'm adding is, and even if it does work, is it the equivalent of das shlema? So it's fast. Look at the next line. So the Gemara says, okay, you're right. We don't have a source. What's this based on? Says the Gemara, Ela kidetanya, yakrivoso, malamed shekofanoso. When a person makes a neder to bring a korban, so the Torah uses the eksproyasera, it says Rashbam, taksiv el zachar tamim yakrivenu, it says yakrivenu twice, as if to emphasize, we're going to not just encourage you, but we're going to push you a little harder when you make a neder to fulfill your neder. It's like, a little more active, a little more of a involved, bezdin. Says the Gemara, Melamed shekofanoso, we force him. How can you force him to bring a korban? Bring a korban is also a transaction, right? Says the Gemara, Yachab al Karcho, Kofanoso, maybe against his will. Talmud Lomar Lirtzono. The Pasuk also says, right, Lirtzono. So how can it be both Bal Karcha and Birtzono? Haketzad. This is where the famous expression comes from. Kofanoso et Shiyom Rotzani. We push him, right? We pressure him until he agrees. But it's not a game. It's not magical words. So what is that? So the Gemara now thinks that that could be a source for Talui V'Zav and Zvini Zvini. Now, what is Kofen Osot Yomer Rotzani? Is that really Ratzon Gamor, or is that compromised, or is that legitimated Kofen?
Why can't you just say that it's that we're trying to divide up a human process when the reality is the law has to see things somewhat finite. There'll be no kinyan if you don't have a mechanism that basically states there's a threshold, and once you get there, no matter how you got there, it's a kinyan. Otherwise, we're talking about seller's remorse, and it's almost like there's always remorse if you look for it. So at a certain point, you got to
that's
say
the question. So
right. I mean, Kofen Rotze is not a question of kafiyah of one versus the other. It's a process. It's a process, and the netter is part of it. You tell the guy you made a netter, so
it's easier. We'll see in a moment, even from the next line of the Gemara. You're making a very good point. And your mentality is really the mentality going forward of the Rajbam. That's why it's ironic. When the Rajbam thought that internal pressure is the source for external pressure, he was saying they're both compromised.
I'm right. If you think about it in real life, there's always.
But now that he's turning it around, he's saying, "Oh, everything is Gomer Makni." It's finding that, as you say,
he has to say
maybe
that,
a low-level threshold.
Otherwise, there's no system. We walk around every day saying, I did it, but I shouldn't have done it. I thought about it.
Part of right.
I mean, there would never be. So it's not a question of. I think the word kaf, the kofin is the pejorative word when it's not a pejorative idea. We just bring things to someone's attention. That's not,
It's more than bring it to his attention.
No, because otherwise, kofin could be a more legal term. We could say other things. He's not allowed to do it. It's an avera to do it. There's never any framework where we use where the word kofin comes out in a halach. At least I don't see it halachically pejorative way. Maybe that's the way.
And in a way, you're anticipating the next line of the Gemara, but that next line of the Gemara is reason why maybe it isn't such a good source for that. I'll explain in a minute. So the very next line of the Gemara, what you're saying is basically what you're saying, but as a qualification. That's right now the Gemara thinks that Karban is an example of Kofin ad Sheoma Rotzani, and I'm wondering whether that's what you're calling the minimal threshold of Rotzon, which is what you're saying, or is it like a more ambivalent, kind of what I'm calling Rotzon Ba'ones, which sometimes is good enough, but it's still a lower level, right? So the next line of the Gemara kind of says what you just said, but it says it in such a way that it makes it a bad source. Look at this, says the Gemara, the Dilma Shiny Hassam, the Nichaleda to have a kapara. Meaning, is Korban really a good example? Well, let's take what you just said, which was, when they talk about kofin, it's like kofin b'mitzvos, right? Meaning if they're doing it for your own good, it's like it's like the Rambam in Perek Beis, Hilchos Gerushin, famous Rambam, basically says about kofin osot Yom Rotzani, like the real you wants to do the right thing. The real you gets all mixed up with other agendas, But if you could strip away the perfect I in there, not I with an E-I-E-Y-E, the I, capital I, like the I, thou I. If you could find the true, authentic I, he wants to do Ritzon Hashem.
Right, it's the revealed will. The revealed will.
Right, but that's when the Gemara is using that idea which you were expressing before, meaning this is a kofin for your benefit, and therefore it's really a Ratzon. It helps you get to the right Ratzon threshold, right? But the Gemara is saying, that's why it's not a good example of the guy when the guy's holding a gun to your head. He's not helping you get to your benefit.
There's always somebody holding a gun to your head.
Say that again.
There's always somebody holding a gun to your head.
So the Gemara is saying basically.
I think what the Gemara
that's what the Gemara originally thought.
But it starts out with such an absurd example to get you to an extreme example, not absurd example, to get you on the path that there's a continuity of will and there's a continuity of doubt, internal and external. But at some point, the Gemara has to help us.
But think of the looting case.
What?
Think of the looting case that Chazan mentioned before, which is a great example. Again, it could be that they just did it and they.
That wasn't kafiyah the way the Gemara is mentioning it here.
No, not kofar sochom aratzani in carbon, or even in get, because again, there's a benefit and there's a constructive element to that. We're doing this for your kapara, or we're doing this for your piety, mitzvah shema. Look at the next line of the Gemara, same thing. But that's why the Gemara is saying it's not a good paradigm for Talui V'Zavin. That guy's a gangster. He's not doing it for you, right? We're being kofar for you to bring your korban because you made a neder and because you need the kapara.
Maybe they didn't really mean it. Maybe they just wanted to draw your attention. It's a shock value example to start the shock.
No. These are it's like these bandits, these the Sarkiko, and that's how we got into it. No, they're serious. It's it's a guy who says, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse, and you really can't refuse.
I mean, just to play devil's advocate, when a guy gives you something as opposed to Geneva, this is not Geneva Gazela, right? They never use the word Geneva or Gazela in this.
We're going to get to that. Not so simple.
Okay, but if you don't, for the moment, if you don't have that.
We're going to see the Gemara Bava Kama, Samach Beis Amud Aleph in a minute, where the Gemara says, what's the difference between a Gazlan, a Chamson, right, which is also the language for kind of a Gazlan, and a Talui V'Zavin Zvini Zvini.
Okay, I'll wait.
So just wait one. You know what? If you want, we can look at that.
No, we'll wait. Wait.
Wait 1 minute. No, let me go through the shock V'Tari first. Anyway, so your point about, kofin is for your benefit. Kofin is, is to make you see the light. That's exactly what the Gemara is saying. But the Gemara is saying that's why it's not a good example. The pirate, the bandit, he's not trying to make you see the light. He's trying to get, he's trying to loot your artwork or to get your field, right? But so that's why it's not a good example, the Gemara says. Now, the same thing with regard to Gittin. The Gemara says, okay, fine. Elami Seifa, another paradigm. A guy doesn't want to give a get. The marriage is irretrievably broken down. He's extorting or he's taking revenge. He's not giving a get. So what we do is kofanoso ad sheyom harotzani. We pressure him. So what do we see? That pressured agreement is agreement, right? Says the Gemara once again, that's not a good example. Why? Because when we're pressuring him there, we're doing it for his own sake. It's a constructive pressure. It's a beneficial pressure. That's where the Rambam makes the comment that I mentioned before, the beautiful comment in Perek Beis Hilchos Gerushin to explain this halacha, that meaning if we could strip away all the ego and the vengeance and all that stuff, he wants to do the right thing too. But if my neighbor, who's a pirate, or not my neighbor, is telling me I'm going to, cause you financial ruin or physical pain if you don't sell me this real estate, right? He's not making me see the constructive light. It's not good for me. How's that a good example?
Is the guy paying though? Is the guy paying? So why is the Gemara not using the word? We'll get to this later. Gazlan or Ganef. They're obviously creating a category.
Because there is still a payment here. I'll get to the
right. Okay. All right.
So it's a little more complicated than that, but it isn't so far from it. And we're trying to explain that it's going to work in the end. We're just trying to figure out why it should work. Now, the Gemara already knows that Rav Huna says it works. The Gemara already knows that we're going to pascha like Rav Huna. The Gemara is playing devil's advocate to try to figure out, like, what is this? What is the model for this? And I'm trying to figure out, and what are the conceptual ramifications of this model? Is it just what you were saying before, which is to figure out that low level, absolute threshold for agreement given a certain reality? Like you say, you can always have remorse your whole life if you want to. That's kind of what the Gemara was originally saying about internal pressure. Or is there something called ratzon al yidei ones, which is a more limited kind of ratzon, but maybe the implications are that it's also subject to greater, it only applies to certain areas of halacha, and it'll only apply under certain conditions, and as we'll see in a moment, and so on, because it is somewhat compromised. There's a difference between, as I say, external pressure and internal pressure, between kofar nosot sheyom harotzani, which is good for you, and something which is being memait bara, you're trying to just, it's hatzala. It's not, picking what's good. So this is the next. So the Gemara there is forced to say elas svarahu, and this is the question. This is the $1 million question. Elas svarahu agav onse gamar makna. So the way the Rashbam reads it, and because the Rashbam was, the Perush al-Atar, so this became very, very influential, is the way you read it, which is, no. It of course, the pirate, the bandit, obviously he's not doing it for me. You can't compare it to the other cases, but in the end of the day, choice is about the moment and the reality and, the options in front of me now. And as you said, this is the way the Rashbam would explain it, you could be remorseful about many things in your life. So this is the reality. You've made a decision and you're going to go for it. However, you have to really agree to it, given the reality. If he's just grabbing your property, obviously that's Gezel. So let me give the other Gemara, the Gemara Bava Kama, which makes things a little complicated and highlights, again, some of these issues. Look at Bava Kama, Samach Beis, Samad Aleph in the Mara Makomos. This is on page... page 4. Everybody have that on top of page 4. Talmud Bavli Masechet Bava Kama, Samach Beis Samad Aleph. This is a very, very famous Gemara. Gemara says, Amalei Rav Ada Bered Rav Avil Rav Ashi. Ma bein Gazlan l'chamson. What's the difference between a Gazlan, a robber, a thief, right, and a chamson? Torah uses the expression you can't be an aid together with the Leos aid Hamas. The expression Hamas appears in the Torah in a bunch of places. We talk about the Dor Mabul, that their biggest sin, Torah says, was they were violators of Hamas. So what's the difference between Gazlan and a Chamsa? Says the Gemara, Amalei Chamsan Yoiv Dami. The Chamsan takes your object against your will, but he pays for it. He leaves you, the full.
It's thuggery. He's a thug.
He's a thug, but he pays for his thuggery, I guess.
They're thugs.
Gazlan, what?
A lot of thugs pay.
Yeah. A Gazlan, but this is top dollar or at least equal dollar. Gazlan lo yoiv dami. The Gazlan just takes, Gazlan's a double thief. He steals your be'en, your object, and he doesn't pay for it. He steals the value of your object.
Le'or yom, usually.
Yeah, I'm not talking about Geneva versus Gzela here. I'm talking about Geneva and Gezela, both versus Chamson. Chamson, yeah. So then the Gemara says, Amar Le, listen to this. This is a very remarkable line. It troubled all the Farshim. The Gemara says, Amar Le yoiv dami, if he's paying for it, right? We'll use your language, even though he's, engaged in thuggery. Chamson Karisle? What's Chamson about him? That's a strange line, because it's one thing to say that he paid for it. It doesn't mean he isn't a Chamson, right? He's still strong-armed, illegal. He's still taking your object.
Because he's going to sell it. I think it's because he's going to sell it to somebody for more money.
Well, but why can't you? Why can't you say the meaning of the Gemara? And the question is, it's not that if you're giving money, if the guy gave money, then he might have started as a Chamson, but now he's a Makna.
But he's not. The other fellow didn't agree.
He's a Kona, rather. In other words, the Gemara.
He's not. I mean, he's still no. The other guy didn't agree. So says the Gemara.
I know, but it just wants to emphasize. It just wants to say that as far as halakhically, we now got to switch our focus and call him something else. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, so the Gemara, but actually, the way the Gemara follows up on the question is to quote our Gemara in Bava Basra. Says the Gemara, "Va'amar Avuna taliv zavin zvini zvini." So they're associating a chamson who just bepashtus takes your object against your will and throws money at you, with somebody who puts a gun to your head and says, choose.
No, I I think the gun to your head is
Wait,
different.
wait, 1 second. Let's finish the Gemara. Says the Gemara lo kasha. I mean, literally, it's talu. Talu means to hang him up. He's threatening to lynch you, right? If you don't sell him, either physically or financially, right? That's what the Gemara. That's what talua means, right? Tola means to hang. Lo kasha hod amarotzani hod lo amarotzani. Wow. Says the Gemara, talui v'zavin zvini. He has to say rotzani. Now, what the magical words doesn't mean the magical words. It also means the magical words. What it means is, in the end of the day, he has to be resigned and accepting. He has to be shalem. He has to come to terms with it. But otherwise, so this is very fascinating. Let me just tell you the following. If you look at the Rashbam in the Gemara, from the very, very beginning, the Rashbam puts in rotzani. Where does rotzani come from? There are two places. One is kofinoso ad shama rotzani, the two Gemaras that we just read about a korban and about a get, right? They both say kofinoso ad sheyomar rotzani. Now comes the Gemara in Bava Kama, which says, what's the difference between a gazlan, a chamson, and talui v'zavin zvini, rotzani. Right? But it's not, this is not mysticism. It's not, he mouths, he just formally mumbles a couple of, it's like an incantation. He says, rotzani, everything is good.
Oh.
Rotzani means, I know I wouldn't have wanted this, but I'm okay with it in the end.
How many times? Go ahead.
Just one more thing. So the Rashbam, hold on to your question for one more minute. It's fascinating that even when the Rashbam introduces Avuna for the first time, he says zvini. A second. No, sorry. Talui v'zavin, misha tolu oso. They hung him up. They were threatening to hang him. Oh, asolo yisurin, or they tortured him. Asolo yisurin means they tortured him physically, right? Ad shemachar, until he was willing to sell, until he agreed to sell. V'kibal adamim, and he received the money. What is the next words? The omer. There's no mandakar shemeh. It's not mentioning the Gemara at that point. Contrast that, the Rashbam, with the Rambam. Again, it's a little late, so I'll just tell you. In the Rambam deals with this topic mostly in Perek Yud of Hilchos Mechira. And in Perek Yud of Hilchos Mechira, when the Rambam codifies the din of Talui v'zavin, zvini, he doesn't mention the requirement of rotzani. In Perek Dalid of Hilchos Ishus, Halacha Aleph, and the Rambam speaks about the parallel case of a shotgun marriage, where you're pressuring a chassan into marrying somebody. The Ravid says, "V'hu sheyama rotzani," but the Rambam didn't say it. The Ravid is criticizing the Rambam for saying it, for not, mentioning it. The only time the Rambam mentions rotzani is in Korban and Gittin, Kofin Oso Sheyama rotzani. But when it comes to the main case of Talui v'zavin or Talui v'kadosh, it's not in the Rambam. So the Beis Yosef and the Bach on the tour, they're both troubled. They say, and what about the Gemara Bava Kama? And what about, Gittin and Korban? They say, you never really have to say rotzani. Rotzani is another way of saying that you shasak o amar rotzani, meaning lo amar lo rotzani. Meaning the only time that you would torpedo a pressured sale would be if the guy says, I don't give in. I refuse to succumb. You're taking it against my will. I don't agree. Or I'm not going to stand in your way because I can't stop you, but I don't agree. But he doesn't need to say, I agree. That's the Beis Yosef. So, the Rambam didn't mention it because the shtika is good too. Doesn't sound that way in the Rambam. Why does he mention it by Korban and by Gittin? The Sivas HaMishpat.
But by Korban I could understand because there is a clear posuk that says Lirtzonchem b'fnei Hashem.
Great point. Not only that, but the Balitosis on Mem Ches Amud Aleph say, you know what? Either way, the fact that you get kapara from this korban requires that you say rotzani, because otherwise it's how can you get kapara from a coerced korban? If you look on Mem here, on Mem Ches Amud Aleph, if you have the Gemara in front of you, Elis Svara, who Agavon Gomer Makne, says Tosas Vim Tomar, Kimin de Misvara, Yadin and the Agavon say Gomer Makne, Am Yitzrich Kro Gabe Korban. Limicht of the Kofin also, kind of exactly what you were saying. If you have the Svara and it works even, what do you need the pasuk by Korban? So says something very insightful. The Shlomar, Ilav Kra Havamina Afagav the Gomer Makne. It might be good enough for a Kinyan, but Kimin Deina Misratze, Ela Yidei Kviya, Paso Hulagabe Mizbeach. The Zevach Rishayimu. Kamash Malon Shak Korban Nirtza. So you were saying it, why do you have to say Rotzani, especially in a Korban, according to the Rambam? Tosas is saying it, same idea in parallel to explain why do you need a pasuk Yakrivenu if Lemaskana we think Agavon say Gomer Makne, say the same thing by Korban. But what this is all highlighting for me is something else, and that is everybody, the Rajbam and others are saying it's all to find that low but determining threshold, like what's considered Gomer Makni. But I don't think that's true. I think according to many Rishonim, the way they're reading the Gemara, there's an in-between. And that's kind of what Tosas is saying too. It could be that Talui Vazav and Zvini Zvini, and it's still not good enough for a Korban unless you say Rotzani or unless you have a Pasuk, because it's still pressured agreement. Maybe there's a category called Rotzon, She'eno Gamur, She'eno Muchlat, Shehu Dafka Al Yidei Ones, and maybe it doesn't always work. So the Sivas HaMishpat says the following. Sivas HaMishpat says, you know what, in my opinion, there are two totally different cases. One is the case in Bava Kama. He says the case in Bava Kama, the Gemara originally thought it was similar to a Chamson, right? Chamson's not holding a gun to your head or threatening to hang you on a noose or giving you or waterboarding you or torturing you. The Chamson is a thug, like you said. He just grabs your object and he throws money at you. That's one case. The Siva says that's not really Rav Huna. Rav Huna is where the guy makes you an offer that you can't refuse. Right? But he leaves the offer, he leaves you to make the decision. There's no decision in the case of the Gemara in Bava Kama. Says the Nesivos, that's why in Bava Kama you have to say Rotzani, because you didn't agree. The only way to get an agreement from you is if after the fact you say Rotzani. You say, you know what? This came about in a very terrible way, right? I wouldn't have wanted, the scenario to unfold as it did. But Rotzani, in the end of the day, it's good. I agree. But if somebody puts a gun to your head or threatens you and says, these are your two choices, and we paskin like Rav Huna, the Agav Onse, Gomer Makni, that, because these are the choices, it's considered choice and it's acceptable, says the Nesivos. You don't need to say Rotzani. Why do you need to say Rotzani? Agav Onse, Gomer Makni. By making the decision that you did, that's the Rotzani. But for the Rambam, in my opinion, neither of these are true. I think what the Rambam held was, the Rambam read the Gemara. Instead of looking for the magical threshold, of what constitutes a minimal Gomer Makni, that is a Ratzon Gomor, I think the Rambam understood the whole Gemara as saying, listen, there is something called Ratzon Gomor. That's a threshold. And there's something else called Ratzon Aideones, which works to a limited extent. The Rambam ties this to another issue. We talked about remorse, and so on. I alluded to it, but let me talk about it for a minute. There's something in the halacha called moda'ah, and it's mentioned here at the end of the sugya, and then it gets its own sugya, and the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch integrate these sugyas. It's something called mesiras moda. If somebody is, everybody knows the word moda because of the famous Chazal, about Kabbalah Satorah, moda daraisa. It's like, that, they, the Klal Yisrael were Kofen Aleim, Har Kigigis,
Yes.
So that's how everybody knows the word modah from. Modah means I establish, right, a document, or I make a formal transaction of refusal in a way. Like I have a shtar written which says the transaction that I'm about to be entered into is against my will, but I have no choice, right? But I want this document, this contract to surface to establish or to prove, my not just remorse, my the absence of real haskama. So this is, of course, the antidote. If you don't want your to suffer physical torture or financial ruin in the case of Talui V'Zavin, like what's your alternative? Right? You can be principled and say no, and then suffer the consequences. There's something called Mesiras Modah. I can call together two Eidim quietly, obviously. You're not going to do it so that the Anas knows. And I can establish, right, my, not remorse, my refusal, and that will undercut the Kenyan. But there's a huge debate among the Rishonim, how easy is it, to validate a modah? Like, to what extent is modah itself a kind of a chiddush? The more you think that Aga Bonse Gomer Makne, is unhappy but effective, and especially it's a real threshold, the more difficult it is to justify the writing of a modah. But of all Rishonim, the Rambam actually felt that you can write a modah more readily, because in my opinion, the way the Rambam read the Gemara was, the Gemara is casting around for a justification,
a way to make it happen. Yeah.
Of how to have ratzon, which is ambivalent, which is ba'onis, and which might work, right? But it's not ratzon gamor. And part of not being ratzon gamor, is reflected by the ability to take, steps to nullify the whole thing, or to invalidate it through a modah. You can't do that in a regular kinyan. Let's say you do a regular kinyan between two people and you say, but I'm going to write a modah, to whatever reason, I want it to look like I'm selling my property, but I'm going to write a modah. Most Rishonim think you can't do that. Right?
So the whole concept of moda'ah has really changed, because today all you do is when you walk into old-fashioned shuls, you see moda'ah on this and not hoda'ah.
That just means I can advertise it. Yeah. No, so the word, it's the same word from the word lahodia.
Yeah, I know.
The moda, the noun, it's a moda'at, it's hear ye, it's be informed. But so obviously it has a common denominator. But the quote unquote, the quotations, the formal legal modah is actually it's you put out the statement before the kinyan that you enter into to invalidate, because you don't have a choice. This is the only way to protect yourself. But the whole interaction, this whole dialectic between, on the one hand, Talui V'Zavin Zvini Agavonse Gomer Makni, and when it doesn't apply, and especially the ability to kind of neutralize it through a modah, is all about the perfect balance, according to different Rishonim, between having effective transactions that are not subject to remorse and cancellation, because otherwise, as you say, it's a legal nightmare, and at the same time having standards and not allowing people's bechira and their haskama and their das makne and their das kona, to be completely compromised. Yeah, go ahead. You had a question.
So this is why what you're saying is consistent with the exclusion of korbanos, because there's no chance for modah there.
Well, yeah, correct. Or
so
again,
that would be the exclusionary aspect to it. It's Bein Adam law. There's really no way to.
That's a great point.
But But just to go back, if you think of, I see this as what all you're saying is consistent, even the Rambam and the Rashbam. Much of life is we do stuff that at the time we don't know it's entirely right. And so like eating spinach when you're a kid, right? So it starts early on, right? And in matters of the Kedushin, but certainly matters of business. So the example of I think what throws everyone off is this idea of the Saracen, the pirate. What they're really talking about is a situation is it happens every day. Someone is really suffering financially, but he or she doesn't want to do the thing that might be best for them. And the Chamsin or whatever it is comes around and says, listen, you got no choice, buddy. You need this money, whether you like it or not. So I'm not going to give you maybe what the optimum price is, but I'm going to get you enough to get by. This happens every day. Loan shark. It's your friends most of the time. It's people do this all the time. They basically take advantage of a situation. That's Chamsin. But the bottom line is, so the Rotza Ani is, okay, I have to do it. Now, obviously, it can't be totally no, but the Gemara is trying to figure out where that, what's that minimum threshold where we know that despite
but again, your examples,
from a capitalistic viewpoint, the Torah looks at it from a more socialistic viewpoint.
I don't think it's socialistic.
It's somewhere between a modified, let's call it a take care of the people capitalistic viewpoint.
I'll tell you, we were talking in previous weeks about,
it's not a goslin for a reason.
There you could argue that there's like more of a social justice, aspect of it. Here it's the opposite. Here we're talking about, acquiescing to people whose, behavior is, halachically improper.
Can I ask
we're just trying to figure out whether, when is an agreement, even if it's entered into.
We have a continuum. What if that happens and a guy says, you know what? You didn't do me any favors. You thought it was Zachin. Could you do modo on that? Halachically.
Zachin is a very...
Zachin is black and white.
What's black and white?
God gives you $1 million.
If there's something ambivalent,
that doesn't trigger something in another contract that's negative. There's no such thing that's black and white on its surface. That's why it's called the surface.
But Zachin is something that's overwhelmingly, beneficial. Whether it's subjectively beneficial or objectively beneficial, maybe next year. But that's a topic. That's a famous Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi says, let's say you have, let's say you're the butler, in the king's palace, so it's freeing you a zachin or a chavin. You're living a high life.
Right.
Or your next, not only do you know where your next meal, where the food in the pantry is. You could, so it's, maybe you like that job. Or no. So whether it's objective or subject, that's something to talk about.
But it's also always looked at in the present tense. We don't try to imagine, well, maybe in 2 years from now it'll turn out to be bad. Zachin is in the present tense.
Because then Zachin's a leap. But I think part of what you're saying is true, but a lot of what you're saying goes in the first line of the Gemara, which was also nidcha, meaning when the Gemara originally thought that there's no difference between internal pressure and external pressure, it was certainly saying exactly what you're saying. Namely, that, in life there are hard choices. Everybody's under... What?
Life is not a straight line, my mother.
Life is not a straight line. I don't know how you do that, by the way, but somehow you've in the last few weeks, you have this thing where you're able to disappear.
I disappeared because I have 2 yard sites. I went to Mincha.
No, he means on the screen.
On the screen, you're able to become half invisible. Like right now, part of you is invisible.
Yeah, it's the way people have their Zoom set up.
I don't know. It's not deliberate. I tell you.
Make background.
Am I right? It's like
if you create a background, that's what happens. Okay. He's not the first. I'm
giving the share, but I'm watching where everybody's.
Because Rabbi, you don't have a frame background. Your background, I can see your father's picture behind you. Your svarim is your background.
Right.
Right.
That's what I want you to think anyway. Okay. Anyways, so the point is that in the beginning of the sugya, they're saying exactly what David President say, which is, these things may look different, but in the end of the day, everything is about picking. Everything is about choices, and everything is about
Continuum.
making.
It's a continuum.
Yeah, but in the end, when the Gemara says no, there is a difference between external and internal. That's the question. At that point, is there a shift conceptually in how we're looking at pressure? And then we're no longer saying, well, according to Rashbam, we're no longer saying that there's something called pressured ratzon. What we're looking for is that sweet spot, which is what you're looking for, of what's the minimum threshold for gomer makni, which is pure das, even under bad circumstances. In my opinion, one could read the Gemara, and I think the Rambam did the exact opposite way. That when we thought we were equating internal and external pressure, that's when we thought everything was gomer makni. And now that we're admitting that there's a difference between taluya v'zavin and internal pressure, namely, I have to put food on the table, I have to pay the tuition bill, I have to sell the candlesticks, the family heirloom. That's part of life. It's an unhappy part of life, but it's a part of, that's a decision that I'm making for sure. But when somebody's pressuring me and it's his agenda, it's not my, internal agenda, whether that also remains, on the level of finding that threshold of das kona das makna, like Rabbi Roth said, or whether or not it is, but it's compromised, and that's why it doesn't work for everything. For example, maybe it wouldn't work for Kedushin completely.
Right.
And maybe that's the reason it doesn't work for Matana. And maybe that's the reason that it wouldn't work, if there were, never mind, Eino no lekarkos, but if it's not up to snuff, it's not going to work, even in karka, even if it's not a problem. Or this is a big issue. The Gemara later on says, and we're running out of time, so I'm just going to tell you, in the Shakla V'Tari, the Gemara says, maybe there's a difference between if the guy says to the robber, the bandit, let's say he says to you, give me one of your fields. Does it make a difference? Or if he says, give me this field? The Gemara thought, you at least have to have some choice, that you could choose the field.
This has to be verbalized?
What? The Gemara originally thought, that's, if you look on the bottom of...
If the person says, look, you're shaking me down, but I have no choice, so I'm going to give it to you, but I really don't want to do it.
So then it's not effective.
Huh?
That's no good. And then the sale is no good.
But that's a good way to save his life and still give the guy the stuff.
Well, but agav onse gomer makni, according to some Rishonim, needs rotzani, and or at minimum, it should not include a statement that says I'm gonna save my life, but I don't agree.
Or the acceptance of the money itself speaks loud.
So that the Gemara, that's called artsuye artzile. Here, just look for 1 minute. I'm just going to do for 1 minute. Here, second. 1 second. Look at the bottom of Mem Chesed Aleph. Yeah. It's the last line on Mem Chesed Aleph. A pressured sale, is a sale. But lo amar, originally the Gemara says, lo amar an ela b'sada stam. That's if he says to you, sell me one of your fields, but you get to choose which one. So by choosing which one, that already establishes a little bit of da. The Gemara says lo. And then the Gemara says, unless ubesada zu nami lo amar no de lo artzi zuze. Now, what does artzi zuze mean? That's a big argument. So some Rishonim think it means that he gets the money right away and he counts the money in front of the other guy, as if to say, no,
Yeah, but everybody counts money. You got to be a fool not to count the money you give.
No, because this guy is holding a gun to your head. You're not necessarily going to count the money.
Maybe. Okay.
By counting the money, it's your way of like saying begrudgingly.
Right.
Accepted, yeah.
Right. But if you don't count the money, according to the, most Rishonim say if you don't count the money or you don't count the money right away, then it's not going to work. It doesn't show, meaning this is the question. Is it basically a good kinyan until you show it's not, or is it not a good kinyan until you show it is?
By the way, one last point. When you
say one more line, just 1 second. That's also very important. The Gemara says, let's say you have a way to run away, or you can call the police. You have a way out, and you don't exercise it, right? Then it's certainly agavon se gamar makni.
when you
But then what's fascinating, finally, and I'm going to take your question, is the Gemara says, none of the halacha, the hilchasa, bekulo havazvini, afilu sadazu. In the end, the Gemara says, no, in all these cases, vini. So is that because the Gemara qualitatively changed its mind, whether this is no good until it's good, and now I think it's good until it's no good? Do you understand what I'm saying? Or no, the Gemara is just saying these pratim don't make a difference.
If the Gemara or those who wanted to say that it's not a good sale, would they then say that the recourse that the person has is to try to force to get it back like you would with a ganef? And therefore, they question the whole thing we have in the Gemara about the price goes up, if the price goes down. Do we equate the same situation to this person if he went to a ganef?
Meaning if there's no sale.
Yeah, according to those who hold that it's not a sale.
Right, or in circumstances where it's a sale. Right, so then the guy gets his money back. But you have to get your property back in the same way.
No, but do we treat it the same? There's all kinds of kinyanim. We got to know them if the price goes up.
Well, it depends if it's karka, right? But it depends, right? It depends if it's karka or metaltalin. Because karka and nigdalis.
In the same class as a gazlan?
I think so. I mean, that goes back to the Gemara in Bava Kama that we were talking about. Ma bein gazlan lechamson l'talui v'zavin. So that is the framework. That's what David asked me before. So how come we're not talking about this in gazlan? So in Bava Kama, they kind of are. They are and they're not. You know, they're just saying, what's the difference? They're asking the question. The question is how you're understanding the answer. Okay, so let me just conclude with this. This is our last year for the season. We spent the whole year, basically, the beginning of the year, 3/4 of the year, discussing, property rights, and especially the rights of neighbors,
privacy,
and the concept of privacy, based on the concept of kedusha, sanctity. Ma tavu alecha. We'll read in the next weeks, right? The Parshas Balak. Ma tavu alecha mishkanosecha Yisrael. The idea of that people have talked about the difference between, Nezek and Bava Kama, Nezek and Bava Basra. People have the right not only not to be damaged, but there's a certain courtesy and harmony and quality of life that, that neighbors are responsible to provide and to facilitate for each other as well. And a lot of the Gemaras in the beginning of the parak, and then shutfim and how they break up the shutfas, and, there has to be a certain satisfactory distribution.
Yeah.
All of these things which show that Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Lazeh, that it's not just there are like crude property rights and ownership, but beyond that there's along with that there are good neighbors, good fences. There are you have an obligation to live on a certain quality level. And then from there, we discussed, well, what about your obligations, even though you're an owner, and your money is your own, and you accumulated it, legitimately. But what about your obligations to your fellow, member of the community who's in need? We talked about kfiyah b'tzedakah, and whether that's a monetary obligation or just a mitzvah or some combination thereof. Can there be kfiyah? Because it's really, your neighbor, the aniyim of Klal Yisrael have rights, and they have the ability to demand de machzor asher yachzor lo, right? Nason titein and basoach tiftach and lo ta'ametz. And so I just think it's very interesting to round out. That's what we're doing today a little bit, just touching the surface. And that is, of course, we have tremendous respect for ownership and quality of life, etc. But the reality of life is that, people face pressures. There are internal pressures and there are external pressures. And, what constitutes, ratzon, haskama, what constitutes an act of will and volition and choice, and in the end of the day, and, how to protect choice and at the same time not stymie the system, as you say, with an excessive concern about remorse. That's also a balance that needs to be struck in an efficient
Whether the best
and an
choice
idealistic
at the moment
system.
is a choice still.
Say that again?
Making the best choice at the moment is still a choice.
Correct. And that's really, so whether or not that is choice, and that's, even ideal choice, even if the circumstances are ideal, or there is a category called pressured choice, where you still have, again, options, to refuse, of course, whether it's Mesiras Moda or not saying Rotsani or other things. But in the end of the day, the idea that there's something called, an ambivalent choice, but an ambivalent choice works maybe in Mecher, but not in Matana. Maybe it doesn't work in Kedushin. Maybe it's without Rotsani, etc. This idea that there is a hierarchy of what constitutes free will decisions, but also a certain realism that decisions are made in a state of pressure is very much also a concern of the halachas, and how to balance, all of that when the obligations people have to you, and then also what happens when they try to take advantage of you.
Everybody doesn't say I was pressured, then you wouldn't have a system.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what you need to balance. I thought that was, in addition to being a fascinating topic, we just touched the surface of it, a lot of details. But I think it's just an interesting counterbalance, in the full range that the halacha, projects in terms of how to the interaction between people. It's not always harmonious, and it's not always about the social justice part. Sometimes it's about, your property was looted or improperly, exploited, and what's your recourse, in that kind of situation too. That's also an important principle. Anyways, I want to wish everybody a good, productive, and healthy summer. We were able to, I think, get through, the challenge of Zoom another year. I don't know what the plan is for next year, but I guess we'll discuss it.
I think we'll start on Zoom, and we could figure out at the Yom Tovim if we should do some in person again.
Yeah,
the new libraries
periodically at least, maybe, so we can
Yeah.
periodically. So we'll figure it out in Mirz Hashem. But it was really a pleasure discussing these
Thank
topics.
you. It was excellent. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Rabbi. It was really
Wish
amazing.
everybody a
Wonderful. Yeah.
terrific summer.